969 years. According to the biblical record, that's the lifespan of Methuselah, positioning him as the longest living person in all of human history. For perspective, imagine if Methuselah had been born in our current era. He would have been present for the establishment of the United States, lived through 2 global conflicts, observed the creation of the Internet, and still possessed hundreds of years remaining. But what made the Almighty permit this single individual to survive for such an extraordinary duration? What set Methuselah apart so completely that his years defied the natural order? And why does his very name translate to mean, when his life ends, it will arrive? The individual who survived beyond the scope of recorded history. 969 years. The figure appears there in the 5th chapter of Genesis, verse 27, blunt and seemingly impossible. Methuselah, the son of Enoch, existed longer than any person who has ever taken breath, longer than civilizations endured, longer than spoken languages persisted, longer than collective memory among entire peoples. His birth occurred during a time when Adam himself still moved upon the earth. Consider that reality for a moment. The original man, the one who once stood within Eden naming each creature, who listened to God's voice during the evening's coolness. Methuselah might have encountered him directly, might have received first-hand testimony about what paradise resembled prior to humanity's fall. When Methuselah finally passed away, the world faced its conclusion. This was not simply someone who experienced great longevity. He represents something considerably more mysterious. He became a living connection, constructed from flesh and bone, linking 2 ages that never should have intersected. The age that emerged pristine and untouched from the Creator's hands, and the age destined for annihilation, submerged beneath waters reaching beyond the tallest peaks. With each passing year of his existence, the earth descended further into darkness. Each birthday he celebrated represented another movement toward divine judgment. During Methuselah's youth, perhaps around 500 years of age, still considered middle-aged according to pre-flood standards, the world overflowed with human beings carrying direct recollections of the garden. These were men and women who had journeyed alongside Adam, who had absorbed from his very lips the meaning of standing, exposed yet without shame in God's presence. By the time Methuselah entered his twilight centuries, those testimonies had ceased. The righteous were departing from life. The corrupt multiplied rapidly. Violence saturated the earth. The creative capacity within human hearts turned exclusively toward wickedness, continuously, without pause. And throughout all of this transformation, a single man persisted. One ancient observer who retained memories of the world's original condition, who witnessed its progressive deterioration. His existence functioned as a timer, a mechanism tracking not merely his personal years, but measuring the forbearance of God himself. Because concealed within his actual name, Methuselah, scholars have discovered something deeply unsettling. The Hebrew linguistic roots point toward a meaning that converts this individual from an anomaly into a prediction. When his death occurs, it will be dispatched. What would be dispatched? The resolution would arrive through water and shadow and the termination of everything. Methuselah occupies the center point of a family lineage unmatched anywhere else in Scripture. Stretching before him extends a sequence of ancestors who survived nearly equal durations. Adam reached 930 years. Seth achieved 912. Enoch attained 905. Kenan lived 910. These were not ordinary individuals experiencing conventional lifespans. They represented something entirely different. Beings whose fundamental biology indicates a world functioning under alternative principles. Following his era arrives the Deluge, and subsequent to the flood, human lifespans collapse dramatically. Noah reaches 950 years, yet his son Shem achieves only 600. During Abraham's generation, people count themselves fortunate to attain 175. By David's time, a lifespan of 70 receives consideration as complete. Methuselah stands as the summit, the pinnacle, the longest inhalation ever drawn. However, Length of existence does not guarantee quality of existence. 9 centuries cannot be considered fortunate if those centuries pass, watching everything you cherish deteriorate and disintegrate. Envision surviving beyond your offspring, your grandchildren, your great-great-great-grandchildren. Envision observing righteousness transform into ancient history, while wickedness becomes standard practice. Envision being the final person who possesses the memory. The Genesis narrative provides the numerical data but conceals the individual. We understand his birth timing. Year 687 following creation, when his father Enoch had reached 65 years. We know his death year, 1656, identical to the year floodwaters ascended. We know he fathered Lamech at age 870, and following Lamech's birth, he continued another 782 years and produced additional sons and daughters. But how did he occupy those years? What occupies a man's thoughts when he has observed 9 centuries elapse, when he has watched the seasons cycle 969 times, witnessed harvests arrive and depart across nearly an entire millennium, when everyone he knew during childhood, everyone he played alongside as a youth, everyone who recognized him as young, has turned to dust and been forgotten? The text remains silent. Yet this silence carries its own message. Methuselah was not merely elderly. He became a mobile archive, a breathing repository of knowledge in a civilization without writing systems, without documented records, without any method for memory preservation except oral transmission and customary practice. The most aged living person assumes responsibility for historical preservation. When Methuselah spoke, his words carried the authority accumulated across centuries. When he recalled events, he remembered occurrences predating anyone else's birth. And when death finally claimed him, he carried away recollections no other soul possessed, the final glimpses of an age never to return. He traversed the complete pre-flood epoch, from its luminous commencement to its shadowed conclusion. He observed the lineage of Seth, the righteous genealogy, the line calling upon the Lord's name, gradually intermarry with Cain's descendants. He witnessed the sons of God selecting wives from humanity's daughters. He saw the Nephilim traverse the earth, those formidable individuals of ancient times, people of great renown, whose very presence corrupted the established order. He witnessed everything, powerless to halt the progression. Perhaps that reveals the genuine tragedy surrounding Methuselah. Not that his lifespan extended so remarkably, but that despite living so extensively, he watched the world perish regardless, watched corruption expand like decay through timber, watched violence achieve normalcy, watched divine knowledge fade from human consciousness until merely a remnant persisted. By his life's conclusion, that remnant had diminished dramatically. His own father, Enoch, had departed early, walked alongside God, and vanished because God removed him. Translation. The ancient writings identify it. Enoch never experienced death's touch. He departed the world at age 365, leaving behind a son, Methuselah, who would remain behind and persevere. Did Methuselah experience envy toward his father? Did he wish during his bleakest moments that God had taken him as well? We possess no answer. The text provides no indication, yet we understand this much. Methuselah's name embodied prophecy. His life constituted a warning, and his death would signal that mercy had reached exhaustion. The name predicting the conclusion. Names carried significance in the ancient world. They were not simple identifiers, not merely sounds distinguishing one individual from another. They possessed substance, destiny, meaning. When a father named his son, he declared truth into reality, a proclamation of what that child would become or what would transpire through him. Enoch gave his son the name Methuselah. The Hebrew form reads Methuselah. Scholars have debated the precise etymology across centuries, yet the most persuasive translation derives from the roots muth, signifying death, and shalach, meaning to send forth or dispatch. Combine these elements and you obtain something that should chill your blood. When his death occurs, it shall be sent. What shall be sent? The judgment, the deluge, the ending. Enoch did not select this name arbitrarily. According to tradition, maintained in sources beyond the biblical text, Enoch possessed prophetic gifts. He received visions regarding future events. He understood humanity's wickedness would reach a critical threshold, that God would not permit evil indefinitely, that judgment was unavoidable. But he grasped something additional, that his son's lifetime would represent a period of grace, an interval for turning away from sin. As long as Methuselah continued living, the flood would not arrive. This understanding transforms everything concerning Methuselah's existence. His life belonged not exclusively to himself. Every breath he drew granted another day of mercy to the human race. Every year he survived provided another year for the wicked to abandon their ways. His longevity was not personal fortune. It functioned as a cosmic timer. The number 969 becomes terrifying when comprehended this way. Each year represented a gift. Each decade meant borrowed time. And everyone on earth existed under the shadow of one man's mortality, whether they recognized it or not. Some Hebrew scholars propose an alternative interpretation: man of the javelin or man of the dart. The ancient term shelach can also indicate a weapon, something launched with lethal purpose. Under this interpretation, Methuselah's name would signify man of approaching judgment or he whose death delivers the spear. Both interpretations arrive at identical conclusions. Methuselah carried a mark from birth. His name was a verdict written in Hebrew, a prophecy embedded within the syllables his mother uttered when calling him to meals. Did he possess this knowledge? Did Enoch inform him? Imagine being that child. Imagine your father explaining that your name means, when you die, the world ends. Imagine carrying that understanding through centuries. Imagine every illness, every mishap, every moment of peril bearing the burden of universal consequence. Methuselah could not experience early death. The world required his survival, yet he also could not exist forever. Eventually, his passing would arrive, and accompanying it, the flood. The biblical text validates this with mathematical exactness. Genesis chapter 5, verse 27 informs us, Methuselah lived 969 years, then died. Genesis chapter 7, verse 6 tells us Noah had reached 600 years when the flood arrived. If you trace backward through the genealogies, calculating each patriarch's age when fathering the subsequent generation, you reach a remarkable conclusion. Methuselah died during the identical year the flood commenced. Some chronology experts argue he passed during the very same month. Rabbinical tradition advances further, proposing he died precisely 7 days before the rainfall initiated. The 7 days of mourning prescribed by custom, during which God waited respectfully for a righteous man's passing. 7 days. That represents how narrowly humanity approached the edge. 7 days separating the oldest man's death from the world's destruction. The prophecy contained within his name materialized with calendar precision. When he died, it was sent. Consider what this signifies for Methuselah's relationship with the surrounding world. He was not simply an aged man. He functioned as a barrier, a wall restraining the waters. As long as he drew breath, hope existed. The moment he ceased, none remained. Did people comprehend? Did they grasp that this ancient patriarch was the sole element standing between them and judgment? Or did they disregard him, ridicule him, dismiss him as a remnant from a bygone era? Scripture suggests the latter. By the time Noah commenced ark construction, the world had forgotten how to fear God. They consumed food and drink, entered marriages, conducted commercial activities as usual. They observed Noah constructing a massive vessel on dry terrain, and they laughed. But they did not laugh at Methuselah. They simply never considered him at all. That might constitute the greatest tragedy, that the walking embodiment of God's patience, the living chronometer of judgment, remained invisible to the generation requiring him most desperately. They passed him on pathways, perhaps saw him positioned in his dwelling's entrance, heard him address assemblies, and never once considered what his death would signify. Enoch understood when he held his newborn son and spoke that name over him. He understood. He comprehended that he was not merely naming a child. He was establishing a timer, the longest timer in human history. Yet, a timer nonetheless. And then Enoch walked with God for 300 years and was taken, removed from the world before witnessing the conclusion. He escaped. Methuselah did not escape. Methuselah remained and bore the weight of that name for 969 years. Every birthday represented a postponement. Every new year meant mercy extended. And when he finally closed his eyes for the final time, when his breathing finally ceased and his heart finally stopped, the name fulfilled itself. It was sent. The genealogy of giants. Genesis 5 reads like rhythmic percussion. Adam lived 930 years, and he died. Seth lived 912 years, and he died. Enoch lived 905 years, and he died. Kenan lived 910 years, and he died. Mahalalel lived 895 years, and he died. Repeatedly, the identical refrain. They lived, they died. This is the record of Adam's generations. The text announces not a casual family diagram, but something more substantial. A documentation of humanity during its initial age, when people did not simply live. They persevered for centuries, transporting memory and tradition forward through time in ways we can scarcely comprehend. These were not common men. They were foundational pillars, each one a breathing monument to the world as it had existed, maintaining history's fabric through sheer longevity. When Adam reached 130 years, he fathered Seth. When Seth reached 105, he fathered Enoch. When Enoch reached 90, he fathered Kenan. The chain continues, each connection forged from an aging father's hand, transmitting something precious to a son. Not merely genetic inheritance, but memory itself. Methuselah represented the seventh generation from Adam, 7, the number signifying completion, divine perfection, born into a world where his great-great-great-grandfather still lived, where oral tradition was not a diminished shadow of written history, but the exclusive history available. Imagine what mealtime discussions were like. Adam could have sat at a table with Methuselah's father. Enoch could have gazed across at a man 5 generations removed and stated, "I remember when death did not exist. I remember when the ground produced fruit without labor. I remember walking with God in the garden." Methuselah would have heard these accounts. Perhaps not directly from Adam. The chronologies indicate Adam died 57 years before Methuselah's birth, but from Seth, his grandfather 5 times removed, who lived until Methuselah reached 234 years. Seth remembered his father, remembered Adam's sorrow over Abel, his complicated relationship with Cain, his attempts at constructing a life in a cursed world. And Seth would have transmitted those memories to his son Enoch, who passed them to Kenan, who passed them to Mahalalel, who passed them to Jared, who passed them to Enoch. By the time the stories reached Methuselah, they had traveled through 6 living generations. Each one a library, each one a guardian of the flame. This is how knowledge survived before writing. Through people, through lifespans measured in centuries, through patriarchs who did not just live extended lives, but who established dynasties, who watched their children's children's children grow elderly, who were the walking histories of humanity. The numbers themselves convey a story. Jared, Methuselah's grandfather, lived 962 years, only 7 years shorter than Methuselah himself. This means when Methuselah was born, his grandfather had already reached 162 years, and Jared lived another 800 years after that, dying when Methuselah was 962. Methuselah spent 962 years with his grandfather, nearly a millennium of shared meals, shared labor, shared conversations. What do you discuss when you have a millennium together? You discuss everything. and you remember everything. The pre-flood patriarchs were not primitive. They were not ignorant. They possessed lifespans permitting knowledge accumulation in ways we cannot fathom. A modern human, studying diligently, might master 2 or 3 disciplines in a 70-year lifespan. What could you master across 900 years? They constructed civilizations, advanced agriculture, metallurgy, music, artistic expression. Genesis 4 mentions Jubal, the originator of those playing the lyre and pipe, Tubal-Cain, the forger of bronze and iron instruments. These were not accidents. They were products of centuries of refinement, of experimentation and failure, of knowledge transmitted downward and expanded upon. Methuselah lived through all of it. Watched technology progress, watched cities ascend, watched the population expand as people multiplied across the earth's surface. The genealogy in Genesis 5 is not merely a catalogue of names. It is a registry of witnesses. Each patriarch is a living testimony to what God had accomplished, what God had declared, what God required, and they were all dying. That is the other rhythmic beat in Genesis 5. And he died, and he died, and he died. Adam died, Seth died, Enoch died. One after another, the lights extinguished. The men who remembered the beginning were vanishing. And with them departed the direct connection to humanity's origin. By the time Methuselah reached old age, relative old age since he remained alive at 700, most of the early patriarchs had departed. Adam long dead, Seth dead, Enoch, Kenan, Mahalalel, all dead. Jared, his grandfather, Methuselah himself, Lamech, his son, and eventually Noah, his grandson. The world was forgetting. As the original witnesses died, testimony became stories, and stories, when they pass through sufficient mouths, become legends, and legends, when encountering skepticism, become myths. How long does transformation from truth to myth require? In our world, sometimes only decades. In the pre-flood world, it required centuries. But it occurred. By the time Methuselah was ancient, people existed who did not believe the old accounts, who thought the tales of Eden were fantasies, who dismissed judgment warnings as the delusions of old men clinging to obsolete beliefs. Methuselah watched this transformation, watched the world lose its memory, watched the knowledge of God fade like a sunset, the light growing progressively dimmer until only the faintest illumination remained on the horizon. He was part of the genealogy of giants, not physical giants, though the Nephilim would appear later, but giants of longevity, of memory, of witness, and he was the last of them, the final one, the man who would outlive everyone, who would carry the most memory, who would see the most history, the man whose death would mean there was no one left worth preserving, the father who walked with God. Enoch was different. The genealogy of Genesis 5 follows a pattern so consistent it becomes rhythmic. Each patriarch is introduced identically. When X lived Y years, he fathered Z. X lived after he fathered Z for N years and had other sons and daughters. Thus, all the days of X were M years, and he died. 7 times this pattern repeats. Adam, Seth, Enoch, Canaan, Mahalalel, Jared, Methuselah. The same formula, the same conclusion, and he died. Then you reach verse 21 and something fractures. When Enoch had lived 65 years, he fathered Methuselah. Enoch walked with God after he fathered Methuselah 300 years and had other sons and daughters. Thus, all the days of Enoch were 365 years. Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. Read it again, notice what is absent, and he died. Every other patriarch in the list dies. Not Enoch. Enoch walked with God, and then Enoch was not. The Hebrew phrase is stark, and he was not. Gone, removed, translated out of the world without passing through death. This is Methuselah's father, the man who raised him. The man whose life and disappearance would have shaped everything Methuselah understood about God, about righteousness, about what it means to walk in faith. Enoch fathered Methuselah at 65, young by pre-flood standards, where men routinely had their first child past 100. The text does not explain why Enoch became a father so early, but it emphasizes something crucial. After Methuselah was born, Enoch walked with God. Not before, after. The arrival of Methuselah changed Enoch. Perhaps it was the burden of fatherhood. Perhaps it was a revelation accompanying the birth. Perhaps God spoke to Enoch and revealed what this child would signify, what his name would represent, what his lifespan would accomplish. Whatever transpired, Enoch began to walk with God, and he walked for 300 years. What does it mean to walk with God? The phrase appears only twice in Genesis before the flood, here with Enoch and later with Noah. To walk with God is more than belief, more than obedience. It suggests intimacy, companionship, a relationship where God and man move together in harmony, where the human aligns his pathway with the divine. In a world growing darker, Enoch walked in light. In a world filling with violence, Enoch walked in peace. In a world where people forgot God, Enoch remembered, more than remembered. He knew God, spoke with God, perhaps even saw God in whatever form the Lord chose to reveal himself before the incarnation. Methuselah grew up in this household. His father was not a normal man. Other fathers taught their sons agriculture, animal care, how to survive in a fallen world. Enoch taught those things too, perhaps. But he taught something more. He taught Methuselah how to hear God's voice, how to recognize the Lord's presence when he drew near, how to distinguish between the world's clamor and the divine whisper. For 300 years, Enoch walked this way. And for at least part of those 300 years, Methuselah walked beside him, father and son moving together through a world that did not understand them. The text says Enoch had other sons and daughters. Methuselah was not an only child, but he was the firstborn, the one whose birth triggered this transformation in his father. He held a unique position, and then one day Enoch was gone. The text gives us no details, no description of what occurred, no moment-by-moment account, just the stark statement, God took him. Enoch walked with God, and then he walked right out of the world. Jewish tradition fills in the gaps with stories. Some say Enoch was taken up in a whirlwind like Elijah would be centuries later. Some say he walked with God one day and simply did not return home. Some say angels came for him, bearing him away to stand in the Almighty's presence. We do not know. But we know this. Methuselah lost his father without burying him. There was no body, no grave, no ritual of mourning, just absence. One day Enoch was there, and the next he was not. How old was Methuselah when this happened? The mathematics is simple. Enoch was 365 when he was taken. He fathered Methuselah at 65. Therefore, Methuselah was 300 years old. 300 years old. Not a child by any measure. A grown man with children and grandchildren of his own. Lamech, his son, was already 113 years old when Enoch vanished. But you are never too old to miss your father. Methuselah would live another 669 years without him. 2/3 of his life would be spent in a world where his father was simply gone, removed, taken into a realm Methuselah could not follow. Did he resent it? Did he wonder why his father got to escape while he had to remain? Did he ever cry out to God in the night, asking why Enoch was chosen for translation while Methuselah was left to endure? Scripture does not tell us, but it tells us something else. Methuselah lived and lived and lived. He did not walk with God the way his father did, or if he did, the text does not record it. His life is summarized in the standard formula. He lived, he fathered, he had other children, he died. No special commendation, no note that he walked with God. Just the bare facts and that staggering number, 969. Perhaps that is its own kind of faithfulness. Not the dramatic holiness of Enoch, but the steady endurance of a man who stays at his post, who does not get raptured away, but remains, who carries the burden of longevity without complaint, who fulfills the prophecy embedded in his name simply by continuing to breathe. Enoch walked with God and was not. Methuselah walked in the world and endured. Both were necessary, one to show what holiness looks like, the other to show what patience costs. The birth of a promise keeper. When Enoch turned 65, he became a father. The timing is peculiar. In the genealogy of Genesis 5, most patriarchs wait considerably longer before their first child. Adam was 130, Seth was 105, Enosh was 90, Jared, Enoch's own father, was 162. But Enoch fathered Methuselah at 65, then walked with God for 300 years. The text presents these facts side by side, inviting us to see a connection. Something about becoming father to this particular child triggered something in Enoch, a revelation, a transformation, a shift in how he understood his place in the world and his relationship with the divine. What did God tell him? What vision did he see? Extra-biblical tradition suggests Enoch received prophetic knowledge about the flood, that God revealed to him the coming judgment, the destruction that would sweep away the world, the cleansing waters that would cover the earth. And perhaps in that revelation, God also gave Enoch a promise that the flood would not come while Methuselah lived. That Enoch's son would be the measure of divine patience, the length of his life directly proportional to the length of humanity's opportunity to repent. If Enoch knew this, he chose the name carefully, deliberately. Methuselah, when he dies, it shall be sent. This was not a curse on his son. It was a covenant, a divine promise that gave Methuselah's life cosmic significance. Every year he lived was mercy. Every breath he drew was grace extended to a wicked world. Enoch named his son, and in naming him set the clock. The text says, Enoch walked with God after Methuselah was born, not before. The birth was the catalyst. Perhaps holding his newborn son, understanding the weight that tiny life would carry, drove Enoch to seek God more deeply than ever before. Or perhaps it was the other way around. Perhaps God came to Enoch when Methuselah was born, revealed the future, and Enoch responded by dedicating himself completely to walking in fellowship with the Lord. Either way, fatherhood changed him. For 300 years, Enoch lived a life of extraordinary devotion. He did not retreat from the world. The text says he had other sons and daughters after Methuselah. He married, he raised children, he lived in community. But through it all, he walked with God, maintained that intimacy, kept that connection, and Methuselah watched, learned, absorbed what it meant to be faithful in a faithless generation. The bond between father and son must have been profound. For 3 centuries, they shared a home, a life, an understanding of what was coming. Methuselah knew his father was different, knew that Enoch spoke with God in ways others did not, knew that the peace and wisdom radiating from Enoch came from somewhere beyond the material world. Did Methuselah try to imitate his father? Did he attempt to walk with God the same way? Perhaps. But the text never says Methuselah walked with God, only that he lived, that he endured, that he fulfilled the prophecy his father spoke over him at birth. Maybe that was enough. Maybe faithfulness does not always look the same. Enoch's faithfulness was the dramatic kind, walking with God, being taken up without seeing death. Methuselah's faithfulness was the patient kind, remaining in the world, bearing witness, extending mercy through sheer longevity. Both men were righteous. Both men pleased God, but their paths diverged. Enoch left early. Methuselah stayed late. At age 187, Methuselah fathered Lamech, another link in the chain, another generation to carry the promise forward. The text does not tell us if Methuselah experienced the same transformation Enoch did, if holding his son triggered some deeper understanding, some prophetic insight. We only know the facts. Lamech was born. Methuselah lived another 782 years after Lamech. He had other sons and daughters, a full life, a large family, centuries of watching children grow, grandchildren multiply, the world's population explode. But through it all, Methuselah carried the knowledge his father had given him, that his life was not his own, that he was part of a larger plan, that when he died, judgment would come. Did that knowledge burden him, or did it comfort him, knowing his life had purpose beyond the personal? We can only speculate, but we know that Methuselah kept the promise embedded in his name. He lived year after year after year, through changing seasons and changing generations, through the slow corruption of the world, through the multiplication of wickedness. He lived, and therefore the flood did not come. Enoch's prophecy, spoken through his son's name, was ironclad. God had given his word, and God keeps his word. Methuselah was the promise keeper, though he kept it passively, simply by existing, by breathing, by refusing to die. In a sense, Methuselah was the most important person in the pre-flood world, more important than kings or mighty men, because he was the dam holding back the waters, the final barrier between humanity and destruction. Enoch understood this. That is why he walked with God so intently after his son's birth. He was living in the shadow of future judgment, raising a child who would one day be the last thread of mercy. And then, at 365, Enoch was taken, removed from the world before he had to see the end. God, in mercy, spared him the grief of watching everything collapse. But Methuselah could not be spared. His role required him to stay, to witness, to endure until the very last moment. Enoch walked with God and escaped. Methuselah inherited his father's knowledge and carried it alone. The translation of Enoch. 300 years after Methuselah was born, Enoch disappeared. The text is brief, almost anticlimactic. Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. No explanation, no description, just absence. One moment Enoch was there, breathing, speaking, existing in the physical world. The next moment, nothing. Gone, removed, translated out of time and space into some other mode of being. Hebrews 11, verse 5, expands slightly. By faith, Enoch was taken up so that he should not see death, and he was not found because God had taken him. Now, before he was taken, he was commended as having pleased God. He pleased God. He was taken. He did not see death. In a world where everyone died, where the drumbeat of Genesis 5 was, and he died, and he died, and he died, Enoch broke the pattern. Death did not touch him. The grave did not claim him. This is a miracle of the first order, a suspension of the fundamental curse that had hung over humanity since Eden. Death entered through Adam's sin and spread to all people. But Enoch slipped through the net. Methuselah watched it happen. He was 300 years old enough to have seen death claim many others. Adam had died 243 years before Enoch's translation. Seth had died too. Methuselah knew what death looked like. He had stood by graves, mourned losses, watched the life drain from eyes and breath cease. But his father did not die. Imagine the moment. Perhaps Enoch said goodbye. Perhaps he knew it was coming. Some traditions suggest God warned him, told him the day of his departure, that Enoch gathered his family, blessed them, gave final instructions, or perhaps it was sudden. Enoch walking in a field, communing with God as he had done for centuries, and then simply stepping out of the visible world into the invisible. Did Methuselah search for him? Did he call out, hoping his father would return? Did he go to the place Enoch was last seen and find nothing? No footprints, no trace, no evidence except the absence. The text does not say, but the absence itself speaks volumes. Methuselah lost his father without burying him. There was no closure, no grave to visit, no physical place to mourn, just the knowledge that Enoch had been taken. that he walked with God so closely that God decided to complete that walk by bringing him home. This had to reshape Methuselah's understanding of everything. Death was not inevitable, not for everyone, not for those who walked with God. Enoch proved it was possible to escape, to bypass the grave, to please God so thoroughly that he rewarded you by lifting you out of the world before it could destroy you. And yet Methuselah remained. He was righteous too, righteous enough that God would honor his death by delaying judgment until after the period of mourning. But he was not translated. He was not taken. He had to stay. Perhaps that is the difference between Enoch and Methuselah. Enoch's role was to show what holiness looks like, to demonstrate that walking with God is possible even in a darkening world, and then to be removed as a sign and a wonder. Methuselah's role was to endure, to remain, to be the living clock, the breathing calendar, the embodiment of God's patience. Enoch got to leave early. Methuselah had to stay until the end. There is no indication Methuselah resented this. No complaint recorded, no bitterness expressed. He simply lived, fulfilled his function, carried the weight his father had placed on him through that prophetic name. But he must have missed Enoch, must have longed at times for the companionship they had shared, for the conversations about God, about righteousness, about the visions Enoch had seen. Now those conversations were over. Enoch was gone, taken into the presence of the Lord, existing in some state beyond Methuselah's reach. And Methuselah was alone. Well, not entirely alone. He had Lamech, his son, who was already 113 years old when Enoch vanished. He had other children, grandchildren, a whole family stretching out across the generations. But spiritually, he was alone in a unique way. His father had walked with God and been taken. His grandson, Noah, would walk with God and be saved. But Methuselah himself stood in between. Righteous, yes, but not translated. Faithful, yes, but not spared the long wait. He was the transition figure, the bridge, the one who connected the age of Enoch to the age of Noah. Jewish tradition says that after Enoch was taken, Methuselah and his grandson Noah became the preachers of righteousness to their generation. That they warned the world of coming judgment, that they called people to repentance while there was still time. 2 Peter 2, verse 5 calls Noah a herald of righteousness. If Methuselah joined him in that work, if the oldest man alive stood beside the ark and testified to what was coming, it would explain the significance of his lifespan. He was not just a clock. He was a voice, a witness, a warning embodied in flesh. Every year he lived, people could look at him and remember the old ways. Remember what the world had been when men walked with God. Remember Enoch, who pleased God so much he was taken. But they did not remember. They did not listen. The world grew worse, not better. And Methuselah kept living, kept warning, kept bearing the weight of his father's prophecy. Enoch walked with God for 365 years and was taken a complete year, symbolically perfect. 1 year for each day of the solar cycle. Methuselah lived 969 years and died. Far longer, far heavier, far lonelier, but perhaps equally faithful in a different way. The faithfulness of staying when you could leave, of enduring when you could escape, of carrying the burden all the way to the end. The book of Enoch's secret. Before Enoch disappeared, tradition says he gave something to his son. Not just a blessing, not just advice, a revelation, a written account of visions he had seen, journeys he had taken through the heavenly realms, knowledge he had received about the past, present, and future. The book of Enoch is not scripture. The ancient Jewish and Christian communities debated its status, and ultimately most churches excluded it from the biblical canon. But portions of it are quoted in Jude, and it was widely read in the early centuries as a witness to how ancient peoples understood the pre-flood world. And according to the book of Enoch, Methuselah was the recipient of his father's apocalyptic knowledge. Enoch saw visions of the flood. He saw the wickedness that would provoke it. He saw the watchers, the fallen angels who came down and mated with human women, producing the Nephilim, giants who filled the earth with violence. He saw the judgment that would come, the cleansing waters, the destruction of all flesh, and he wrote it down, gave it to Methuselah, told him to preserve it, to guard it, to pass it on to those who would come after. In the book of Enoch, chapter 82, Enoch speaks directly to his son. "And now, my son Methuselah, all these things I am recounting to you and writing down for you. I have revealed to you everything and given you books concerning all these. Preserve, my son Methuselah, the books from your father's hand, and deliver them to the generations of the world." If this tradition holds any historical memory, it means Methuselah was not just the longest-lived man. He was the guardian of sacred texts, the keeper of prophetic knowledge, the one who held the explanation for what was happening to the world. Think about what that means. While violence spread, while the Nephilim walked the earth, while wickedness became normal and righteousness rare, Methuselah possessed the books his father had left him, books that explained everything: why the world was falling apart, why the watchers had rebelled, why judgment was coming. Did he share this knowledge? Did he try to warn people by reading from his father's writings? Or did he keep them hidden, knowing that those who were wicked would not listen and those who were righteous already understood? The book of Enoch also contains prophecies about the Messiah, about a future kingdom where righteousness would reign, about the resurrection of the dead and the final judgment. Enoch saw beyond the flood to the ultimate restoration of all things. Methuselah, if he possessed these writings, carried hope as well as warning. He knew the flood was not the end, that God had a plan beyond the destruction, that from the remnant, Noah and his family, would come a new beginning, and from that new beginning would eventually come the Redeemer. This would have sustained him through the dark centuries, when everything seemed to be spiraling toward oblivion, when wickedness triumphed and the righteous shrank to a handful. Methuselah could look at his father's books and remember, God is not finished. Jewish tradition says Methuselah passed the book of Enoch to his grandson Noah, that Noah took it with him into the ark, preserving it through the flood. That after the waters receded, Noah gave it to his son Shem, who gave it to Abraham, and so on down the line. Whether or not this happened, the tradition reveals something important. Ancient peoples understood Methuselah as a link in a chain of revelation. He received knowledge from Enoch. He preserved it through the worst period of human history. He passed it on to Noah. He was a guardian, a steward, a keeper of mysteries. This adds another dimension to his life. He was not just marking time, not just existing until his prophesied death triggered the flood. He was actively preserving knowledge, maintaining witness, ensuring that the testimony of his father did not die with Enoch's translation. In a world without printing presses, without libraries, without institutional means of preserving texts, the preservation of knowledge depended on people, on scribes who copied manuscripts, on elders who memorized traditions, on patriarchs who guarded precious documents. Methuselah lived 969 years. That is a long time to guard books, a long time to keep secrets, a long time to wait for the fulfillment of prophecies you have read over and over until you have them memorized. Did he read his father's writings every year? Did he take them out, unroll the scrolls, run his aging fingers over the words Enoch had written centuries ago? Did he show them to Lamech, his son? Did Lamech believe? Did he understand that his son Noah would be the one to survive, the one through whom humanity would continue? The text does not say, but the silence invites us to wonder. Methuselah was more than a number. He was a man with knowledge, with responsibility, with a burden that went beyond simply existing. He held in his hands, or in his memory, the explanation for everything that was happening. And when he died, that knowledge passed to Noah, the man who would need it most, the man who would build the ark and save a remnant and carry humanity through the judgment into a new world. Perhaps that is why Methuselah had to live so long, not just to delay the flood, but to ensure the knowledge survived. to be the bridge between Enoch's revelation and Noah's obedience. The secret his father gave him was not just a burden, it was a treasure, a light in the darkness, a promise that even when everything was washed away, God's plan would continue. Methuselah carried that secret for 969 years, and when he died, he left it in the hands of the one man who could use it, the birth of Lamech. When Methuselah was 187 years old, his son was born. By pre-flood standards, this is late. Methuselah had been alive for nearly 2 centuries. He had watched his father Enoch walk with God. He had seen generations rise and fall. He had witnessed the world slowly sliding toward corruption. And now he became a father himself. He named the boy Lamech. The name means powerful, or one who is brought low, depending on how you translate the Hebrew root. Scholars debate the exact etymology, but the meaning carries weight either way. Power or humility, strength or weakness. Lamech would be both. He lived in the shadow of extraordinary men. His grandfather Enoch had walked with God and been taken. His father Methuselah would outlive everyone. His own son, not yet born, would be Noah, the man chosen to save the world. Lamech himself was ordinary by comparison. No dramatic commendation in Scripture, no note that he walked with God, just the genealogical facts. He lived 777 years. He fathered Noah and other children. He died, but those facts tell a story. Methuselah, now a father, had to raise a son in a world growing darker. He was 187 when Lamech was born, which means Enoch, Methuselah's father, was still alive. In fact, Enoch would live another 113 years before being taken. For 113 years, 3 generations walked together. Enoch the prophet, Methuselah the promise keeper, and Lamech the ordinary man. Grandfather, father, son, what were those years like? Did Enoch teach his grandson Lamech the way he had taught Methuselah? Did Lamech hear firsthand about walking with God, about visions of judgment, about the flood that was coming? Probably. The ancient world depended on oral tradition, on the passing of knowledge from elder to child. Enoch would not have kept silent. He would have taught, warned, prepared the next generation for what was ahead. Lamech grew up knowing the world was doomed. Think about that. From childhood, he understood that judgment was inevitable, that wickedness had reached a level God would not tolerate, that one day everything would be washed away, and he knew that his father's death would be the trigger. That as long as Methuselah lived, there was time. But when Methuselah died, the countdown would begin. How does that knowledge shape a person? Does it make you careful, clinging to every day? Does it make you bold, knowing time is limited? Does it make you desperate, trying to warn people before it is too late? We do not know much about Lamech's personality, but we know he lived for 777 years. The number 7 repeated 3 times. The number of completion, of perfection, tripled. Some see in this a sign of divine blessing. Some see it as symbolic completeness. Whatever it means, Lamech's lifespan is the shortest of the patriarchs before the flood, except for Enoch, who was translated. Everyone else lived into their 900s. Lamech only reached 777. He died 5 years before the flood. 5 years before his own father, Methuselah. He did not have to see the end. He was spared that grief. But before he died, he did something crucial. At age 182, he fathered a son, and he gave that son a name loaded with meaning and hope, Noah, which means rest or comfort. Genesis 5, verse 29, records Lamech's words when he named his son. Out of the ground that the Lord has cursed, this one shall bring us relief from our work and from the painful toil of our hands. This is prophecy. Lamech, surrounded by a cursed world, looked at his newborn son and saw something different, saw the possibility of rest, of relief, of an end to the grinding toil that had marked human existence since Adam's fall. Did Lamech know Noah would build the ark? Did he understand his son would be the savior of humanity? Or was he speaking in hope, naming his child after his own desperate longing for things to change? We cannot be certain. But Lamech's words were true, even if he did not fully understand their meaning. Noah would bring rest, not by ending the curse, but by surviving the judgment, by preserving humanity through the flood, so that eventually, many generations later, the ultimate Noah, Jesus Christ, could come and bring true rest. Methuselah, now nearly 370 years old, held his grandson, the baby who would one day build an ark, the child through whom the promise would continue. How much did Methuselah understand? He possessed his father Enoch's writings. He knew about the coming flood. He knew his own death would signal its arrival. Did he look at baby Noah and realize this child would be the survivor? Did he know in that moment that the line of promise would continue through this tiny infant in his ancient arms? Probably. And if he knew, it changed everything about how he viewed his own life. He was not just delaying judgment. He was buying time for Noah to grow, to mature, to be ready for the task ahead. Lamech fathered Noah. Methuselah watched over them both, and the world continued its descent into wickedness, oblivious to the drama playing out in the household of the righteous. 3 generations, Methuselah the oldest, Lamech the middle, Noah the youngest, all of them carrying the knowledge of what was coming, all of them waiting. Lamech lived 777 years. He died when Noah was 595 years old, 5 years before the flood. He did not have to endure the final countdown, did not have to stand on the banks while the flood rose, did not have to watch the world drown. But he raised the son who would. He prepared Noah, taught him, passed on the knowledge Methuselah and Enoch had given him. When Lamech died, Methuselah mourned his son. Then he turned to his grandson and continued the work, preparing, warning, waiting for the moment when his own breath would stop and the waters would come. The world grows dark. The world Methuselah inhabited was not the world Enoch had been born into. Something had shifted. Some fundamental line had been crossed. The corruption that began with Cain, murder, violence, pride, had metastasized. What started as individual sin had become systemic wickedness. Genesis 6, verse 5, will eventually state it plainly. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Every intention, only evil, continually. This is totalizing language, complete moral collapse, not just bad actions here and there, but a wholesale corruption of human imagination and desire. The heart, the core of human motivation, had become a factory of wickedness, producing nothing but evil all the time. Methuselah watched this happen over centuries. When he was young, there were still many who remembered the old ways, who called on the name of the Lord, as Genesis 4, verse 26 says, people began to do in the days of Enoch, who maintained some connection to the worship of the true God. But as the generations turned, those voices grew quieter. The population exploded, people multiplying across the face of the earth. And with that multiplication came diversification. Different communities, different cultures, different gods. The knowledge of the Creator became localized, preserved in certain families, Methuselah's family primarily, but fading elsewhere. In other regions, people worshipped idols, carved gods from wood and stone, made sacrifices to powers that were not the one true God. And then the Nephilim appeared. Genesis 6, verses 1 to 4 describes something strange and terrible. When man began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown, sons of God. Nephilim, mighty men of renown. The text is deliberately cryptic, but the result is clear. Some unnatural mingling occurred, some crossing of boundaries that should not have been crossed, and the offspring of this mingling were giants, warriors, men of violence and power. The Nephilim filled the earth with oppression. They were mighty, yes, but their might was turned toward domination, toward conquest, toward the subjugation of ordinary humans. The men of renown were not heroes. They were tyrants. Methuselah saw them, perhaps encountered them, perhaps watched as they established their rule over regions of the earth, turning local populations into subjects and slaves. The violence of these beings intensified the general corruption. Where there had been moral darkness, now there was physical terror. People feared the Nephilim, and in fearing them, some worshipped them, treated them as gods. The line between the human and the divine had been breached, and the result was chaos. Jewish tradition, preserved in texts like Jubilees and 1st Enoch, expands the story. The sons of God were angels, specifically called watchers, who were assigned to watch over humanity. But they fell. They lusted after human women, descended to earth, took wives, and produced hybrid offspring. And they did not stop there. According to these traditions, the watchers taught humanity forbidden knowledge: how to forge weapons of war, how to craft cosmetics and ornaments that fed vanity, how to perform enchantments and astrology, how to manipulate the natural order through sorcery. Technology and occultism exploded together. The pre-flood world became advanced in ways that both impressed and horrified. Cities rose, armies formed, trade networks spread across the land, but none of it was directed toward God. None of it aimed at righteousness. The knowledge was used for violence, for pleasure, for the glorification of power. Methuselah walked through this world, a righteous man in a rotting civilization. Everywhere he went, he saw the evidence of humanity's fall. Markets full of stolen goods, streets stained with blood, temples dedicated to false gods, women and children crying because the Nephilim had taken their husbands and fathers. He was powerless to stop it. One man, even one who lived for centuries, cannot halt a global collapse. He could warn. He could testify. He could maintain his own household in righteousness, but he could not save the world. Genesis 6, verses 11 to 12 summarizes the situation. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence. And God saw the earth, and behold, it was corrupt. For all flesh had corrupted their way on the earth. Corrupt, violent, all flesh. The phrase all flesh includes animals. Some interpreters suggest the corruption had spread even to the animal kingdom, that the unnatural mingling of the Nephilim had somehow tainted the biological order itself. Whatever the exact mechanics, the picture is clear. The world was ruined, beyond redemption, beyond recovery, through any natural process. Methuselah knew this. He had his father's writings. He understood that God would not tolerate evil forever, that judgment was decreed, that the flood was coming, and he knew his own life was the only thing holding it back. Every year he lived, the world grew worse. Every decade, the wickedness intensified, and every century, Methuselah's existence became more anomalous. A living relic of a better time, a walking reminder of what humanity had been and what it had lost. The violence was the worst part. Genesis emphasizes this. Not just immorality, not just idolatry, but violence. The earth was filled with it. People attacked each other without provocation. The strong preyed on the weak. Law and order collapsed. Might made right. The Nephilim led the way, but humanity needed no coercion to follow. The seeds of violence were already there, planted by Cain when he killed his brother Abel. Now those seeds had grown into a forest of thorns, choking out everything good. Methuselah was old enough to remember when it was different, when murder shocked people, when violence was rare and punished, when communities regulated themselves through shared moral standards. Now those standards were gone. The imagination of man's heart was only evil continually. And Methuselah kept living, kept breathing, kept holding back the flood by the simple fact of his existence. He was the dam, and the waters were rising. The birth of Noah. Lamech was 182 years old when his son was born. The labor was ordinary. The child was not. Lamech looked at his newborn son and spoke words that echoed across the centuries. Out of the ground that the Lord has cursed, this one shall bring us relief from our work and from the painful toil of our hands. Relief. Rest. The Hebrew word is Noah. Lamech named his son Hope. Methuselah, now nearly 370 years old, held his grandson and understood. This was the one, the child through whom the line would continue, the boy who would carry humanity through the coming judgment. How did Methuselah know? Perhaps Enoch's writings had been specific. Perhaps God revealed it directly. Perhaps it was simply the certainty of faith, a knowledge that comes from walking with God for centuries, from watching his promises unfold, from trusting that what he begins, he will complete. Noah arrived at a crucial moment. The world had reached its nadir. The Nephilim ruled. Violence filled the earth. Every thought of the human heart was only evil all the time. Into this darkness, a light was born. Small, helpless, utterly dependent on the protection of his righteous family. Methuselah looked at this baby and saw the future, saw survival, saw the continuation of everything he had lived for, everything Enoch had walked for, everything God had promised from the beginning. But he also saw the cost. Because for Noah to be saved, everyone else would have to be destroyed. For this one family to survive, millions would have to perish. The flood would not be a minor local event. It would be the undoing of the world. Waters covering the entire earth. Every living thing that breathed exterminated. Cities drowned. Civilizations erased. The accumulated knowledge and culture of 15 centuries washed away. All of it gone, except Noah, except the 8 people who would enter the ark. Methuselah held this knowledge along with his grandson. The joy of new life mixed with the grief of coming death. The hope of salvation shadowed by the horror of judgment. Noah grew. Lamech and his wife raised him in the fear of the Lord, teaching him what Methuselah and Enoch had taught them. The child learned about creation, about the fall, about Cain and Abel, about the line of Seth and the promise of a coming Redeemer. He learned about the flood, about the prophecy in his great-grandfather's name, about the role he would one day play. Did Noah believe it as a child? Or did it seem like a story, like something distant and unreal? At some point, he had to come to terms with what he had been told, had to decide whether to trust the testimony of his fathers or to dismiss it as the superstitions of old men. He chose to trust. Genesis 6, verse 9 will say of him, Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God. Like his great-great-great-grandfather Enoch, Noah walked with God. The phrase returns, applied to Noah alone in a world where everyone else walked in wickedness. Methuselah must have rejoiced to see this, to watch his grandson grow into righteousness, to witness the formation of character in a young man who would be tested beyond anything any human had faced. The relationship between Methuselah and Noah would have been profound. Nearly 600 years of shared life, 6 centuries of conversation, of teaching, of preparing. Methuselah was the link to Enoch. He carried the prophetic tradition. And Noah was the ultimate fruit of that tradition. The man who would embody faith so completely that he would build a boat on dry ground and fill it with animals despite having never seen rain. Jewish tradition suggests Methuselah helped Noah understand what was coming. That the ancient patriarch spent his final centuries interpreting Enoch's visions for his grandson, explaining the signs, preparing him for the moment when God would give the command to build. When Noah was 480 years old, God spoke to him, gave him specific instructions, an ark, dimensions, materials, a plan for survival. Methuselah was there, ancient beyond measure, but still alive, still watching, still waiting for the prophecy in his name to fulfill. For 120 years, Noah built, and for 120 years, Methuselah watched the construction, saw the massive vessel take shape, saw the timber cut and shaped, the pitch applied, the interior compartments built. He knew what it meant. Every plank hammered into place was another step toward the fulfillment. Every rib of the ark was another marker on the countdown. When the ark was finished, Methuselah knew his time was almost over. Noah was ready. The vessel was complete. The animals would soon arrive. All that remained was for Methuselah to close his eyes for the last time, and then the waiting would end. The mercy would expire. The judgment would fall. Noah was ready. The world was not, and Methuselah stood between them, the final barrier, the last thread of grace. His grandson would survive. Of that, Methuselah was certain. God had promised. God would deliver. But everyone else, all the friends, all the distant relatives, all the millions who filled the earth, they would perish. They had been warned. For 120 years, Noah preached righteousness while building the ark. For centuries before that, Methuselah testified simply by existing, a living reminder of God's patience. No one listened. No one repented. No one asked to enter the ark. So Methuselah held his grandson close and waited for the end. The preacher of righteousness. The hammer strikes wood one more time. Noah's hands are calloused beyond recognition. His back aches from decades of bending, lifting, measuring, but he keeps building. And beside him, watching with eyes that have seen centuries unfold, stands Methuselah. The old patriarch moves slowly now. His joints protest with every step, but his voice carries the weight of nearly 900 years when he speaks to the crowds that gather to mock. They come daily. Merchants traveling through, farmers from nearby settlements, young men flexing their strength, laughing at the massive wooden structure rising from the ground, an ark on dry land, miles from any sea. The concept is absurd to them. Methuselah remembers when his father Enoch first spoke the words, "When he dies, judgment comes." The old man had carried that knowledge like a stone in his chest for centuries. Every morning he woke, he knew. Every night he lay down, he remembered. The world would end. Water would come. Everything would be washed away. And now his grandson builds the only escape. Rabbinic tradition preserves stories from these years. Methuselah and Noah standing together before hostile crowds. The oldest living man and the chosen builder, both speaking words that fell on deaf ears. "Turn back," Methuselah says. His voice cracks with age, but carries across the construction site. "You have seen the wickedness increase. You have watched violence spread like disease through every settlement. This is your warning." Someone spits at his feet. Another laughs, loud and mocking. "Old fool, you have lived too long. Your mind has softened." But Methuselah continues, because what else can he do? His father walked with God and vanished from the earth. His grandson received direct instructions from the Creator, and he stands between them, a bridge of flesh and bone, witnessing the final countdown. The ark grows larger, month by month. Gopher wood sealed with pitch. 3 decks, 1 door. Dimensions that seem impossible until you watch them take shape under skilled hands. Noah works mostly in silence, his sons helping. Shem, Ham, Japheth, young men who have known only this task for most of their lives. Their wives prepare food. Methuselah moves among them, speaking blessings, offering encouragement. And to anyone who will listen, he speaks of what is coming. The book of Jasher records these warnings. 120 years of preaching, 120 years of people hearing and refusing. They saw the evidence before them. Massive timbers cut and hauled, a structure unlike anything built before. An old man who had lived through history itself. telling them to prepare. They chose mockery instead. Methuselah watches them walk away and feels the weight of every year he has lived. All that time, all those opportunities to turn humanity toward righteousness. His father had tried through his walk with God. Noah tried through his obedience, and Methuselah tried simply by continuing to exist, by being a living reminder of what came before. None of it mattered to the crowds. Violence had become normal. Corruption felt like the natural order. The Nephilim walked the earth, offspring of fallen beings and human women, and people had grown accustomed to the unnatural. Wickedness no longer shocked. Evil no longer disturbed. Every imagination of man's heart was only evil continually. The text states this plainly. Not that men did evil things occasionally, not that they struggled with temptation, but that their very thoughts, their constant internal dialogue, their imagination itself had become thoroughly corrupted. Methuselah sees it in their eyes when they look at the ark. Not curiosity, not even healthy skepticism, just emptiness, just the hollow stare of people who have silenced every whisper of conscience. He prays for them anyway. At night, when the work stops and the mockers disperse to their homes, Methuselah walks the perimeter of the ark. His hand touches the pitch-sealed wood, solid, real, a testimony in timber and resin. Noah finds him there sometimes. They do not always speak. The grandson and the ancient grandfather, standing in the gathering darkness, both knowing what approaches. "How much longer?" Noah asks one evening. Methuselah looks at his own weathered hands, feels the heaviness in his bones, the way his breath comes shorter now, the subtle loosening of his grip on life itself. "Not long," he says, because he knows the prophecy. His father Enoch had made it clear. God had promised the flood would not come while Methuselah lived. His very existence was the dam holding back judgment. Every breath he drew was another day of mercy for the human race. Every year he survived was another year the wicked had to turn from their ways. His longevity was not a personal blessing. It was a cosmic countdown. But dams do not hold forever. And Methuselah is old, older than any human before or since. His body has endured beyond reasonable limits. He exists now almost as a supernatural mercy. A grace period given flesh and blood. The people do not realize they are living on borrowed time. They do not understand that the old man they mock is the only reason they are still alive. Methuselah returns to the warnings the next day, and the next, and the next. Some traditions say he wept when he preached, tears running down a face carved by centuries, pleading with people to see what was obvious. The ark stands before them. Evidence made manifest. But evidence means nothing to those determined not to see. Noah's sons sometimes ask their great-grandfather about the old world, about Adam, about Seth, about the days when righteousness was more common than corruption. Methuselah tells them what he remembers. Stories passed down, accounts preserved in living memory. He was born before Adam died. The first man walked the earth during Methuselah's childhood. The garden was a recent loss. Then the cherubim still guarded the way to the tree of life. Everything changed slowly, then quickly. Wickedness crept in like water through cracks. Violence became acceptable. Standards eroded. The knowledge of God faded from generation to generation until entire communities lived as though heaven was a myth. Remember this. Methuselah tells his great-grandsons, remember how it happened. Remember how people forgot, because you will rebuild. You will repopulate, and the same choices will face your descendants. They listen. They are the only ones who do. The ark nears completion. Final measurements, last timbers, the doorframe reinforced, storage areas for food, pens for animals, everything, according to the precise instructions Noah received. Methuselah watches it all come together and feels time slipping. Not like sand through fingers, more like breath leaving lungs. A gentle but irreversible exodus. He is the last connection to the old world. When he goes, the final witness will be gone. No one left who remembers. No one who can say, "I was there when Adam spoke of the garden." No one who can testify to God's direct dealings with early humanity. The role weighs heavy, but the burden is almost done. One morning, Methuselah looks at the completed ark and knows the structure is ready. Noah is prepared. The animals will come when summoned. Everything stands in position. Only one piece remains: his death. The prophecy embedded in his name waits for fulfillment. When he dies, it shall be sent. The judgment, the flood, the washing away of everything corrupt and violent and evil. He has lived as God's patience. He will die as God's permission. The people still do not understand. They see an old man growing weaker. They do not see the clock running out, do not recognize that his final breath will be their final warning. Methuselah continues preaching anyway, right up to the end, speaking truth to crowds that have stopped listening, offering hope to hearts that have hardened beyond feeling, because that is what righteousness demands. Not success, just faithfulness. His father Enoch walked with God for 300 years after his birth. Methuselah has walked among men for 969 years. Different paths, same purpose. Both testifying that God is real and judgment is coming. The mockers will learn soon enough. They just will not survive the lesson. The longest life, the longest patience. 969 years. The number strains comprehension, stretches the imagination beyond comfortable limits, demands we reconsider everything we think we know about time, patience, and divine purpose. But this was not random. Methuselah's extraordinary lifespan carried meaning beyond mere biology. Each year he breathed was a year humanity received. Each sunrise he witnessed was another sunrise of grace for a world spiraling toward judgment. God was being patient, and Methuselah was the embodiment of that patience. The theological weight of this becomes clear when we map the chronology, calculate the years, match Methuselah's death with the flood's arrival. The numbers align with disturbing precision. According to the biblical timeline, Methuselah passed away the same year the flood came. Not a year before, not a year after, the exact same year. Some traditions go further. They claim Methuselah breathed his last, the same week the waters rose, that God waited the 7 days of mourning, honoring his servant with a final courtesy before unleashing judgment. If true, this means Methuselah's life was a countdown clock. Every birthday that passed brought humanity 1 year closer to destruction. Every season he survived was a season the world continued. His very existence was intercession, whether he realized it fully or not. God had made a promise to Enoch. The flood would not come while his son lived. Therefore, Methuselah's longevity was not blessing, at least not primarily for him. His extended years were blessing for everyone else: the wicked, the violent, the corrupt, those who mocked the ark and laughed at warnings. They lived because he lived. This reframes everything about his story. Methuselah was not just an old man who happened to live a long time. He was a walking grace period, a breathing reprieve, the physical manifestation of divine mercy extended to its absolute limit. 2 Peter would later describe this principle. The Lord is not slow concerning his promise, as some count slowness, but is patient toward you, not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. Methuselah was that patience in flesh. Consider what this meant for him personally. He watched the world grow darker year after year, witnessed corruption spread, saw violence become normal, observed wickedness celebrated, and righteousness mocked. And he kept living. Not because he was hiding from death, not because he was clinging to life out of fear, but because God sustained him, kept his heart beating, kept his lungs drawing breath, kept him standing as the final barrier between humanity and judgment. The burden must have been crushing. Every morning he woke, he carried the knowledge that his death would trigger catastrophe, that when his eyes finally closed for the last time, the world would end. Billions would perish. Only 8 souls would survive. How do you bear that? How do you continue through centuries knowing your demise will be the signal for global destruction? The text does not tell us Methuselah's internal struggle. We get no psalms from him, no recorded prayers, no journal entries processing the weight of his existence, but we can infer from his actions. He kept warning people, kept speaking truth, kept standing beside Noah as the ark took shape. Right up until the end, he was trying to turn hearts toward God. Because that was the whole point of the extended years. Not that Methuselah would live forever, but that people would have time to repent. God was demonstrating his character through one man's lifespan, showing that judgment, though certain, was not hasty, that mercy extended as far as possible, that every opportunity for repentance would be given before the final accounting. Methuselah was the proof. 969 years of proof. But patience has limits. Mercy has boundaries. There comes a moment when grace ends and justice begins, when the door closes, when the time for choosing has passed. For the pre-flood world, that moment was tied to one man's mortality. Methuselah's life measured their opportunity. His death marked its end. This creates a sobering parallel for every generation. God's patience with humanity continues. Judgment delayed does not mean judgment cancelled. The gap between promise and fulfillment is filled with mercy, giving people time to turn. But the clock runs. Methuselah's story forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. How long has God been patient with our generation? What warnings have we ignored? What evidence stands before us while we mock and continue in wickedness? The text shows us the psychology of those final years before the flood. People eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, carrying on with normal life despite clear warnings, despite a massive ark being built, despite the preaching of Noah and Methuselah. They assumed tomorrow would be like today, that patterns would continue, that warnings were exaggerations, until the day the door closed and the rain began. Methuselah's extended life gave them no excuse. They had centuries of warning, centuries of a living reminder that judgment approached, centuries of an old man who should not still be alive, whose very existence testified to divine patience. They ignored all of it, and when Methuselah finally died, the grace period died with him. The flood came, not because God was cruel, but because patience extended to its maximum had been thoroughly exhausted. Every opportunity had been given. Every warning had been spoken. The evidence had been presented, year after year, decade after decade, century after century. Methuselah was that evidence, walking among them. His 969 years were 969 years of mercy, and they wasted every single one. The theological principle here transcends the flood narrative. It speaks to how God deals with humanity across all ages. Judgment is real, promised, certain, but God delays its execution, giving people time to respond. However, the delay is not indefinite. Methuselah's life had a limit. So does God's patience with any generation. The question is never whether judgment will come, only when, and whether people will use the time they are given to turn toward righteousness. For Methuselah himself, the long life poses another question. The text records that he lived and died, but did he walk with God like his father Enoch? We are never told. He stands in Scripture as a transitional figure, son of the man who pleased God so thoroughly he escaped death, grandfather of the man who found grace in God's eyes and saved humanity. But Methuselah himself, the record is silent on his spiritual state. Perhaps that is intentional. Perhaps his life itself was the message. Regardless of his personal walk, he did not need to be Enoch, did not need to be Noah. He needed to be the boundary marker, the living clock, the manifestation of divine patience. He fulfilled that role for nearly a millennium. When his purpose was complete, when the ark stood ready and Noah's family had been warned, when every possible extension of mercy had been granted, Methuselah was released from his burden. He closed his eyes. His breath stilled. His ancient heart beat its final rhythm. and the countdown ended. The longest human life in recorded history became the final marker of the longest demonstration of divine patience the world had yet seen. 7 days later, the flood came, the dwindling remnant. The names fade like footprints in sand. Adam, gone. Seth, past. Enoch, Kenan, Mahalalel, Jared, each generation of the righteous line dying off, one by one. The great patriarchs who had walked the earth since nearly the beginning, who carried memories of Eden itself, who preserved the knowledge of God through living testimony, all disappearing into death. By Methuselah's later centuries, the landscape of righteousness had become devastatingly sparse. The world teemed with people. Settlements sprawled across the ancient lands. Markets bustled. Armies marched. Merchants traded. Life continued in all its mundane complexity. But those who remembered God, those who called on His name, those who resisted the tide of corruption, you could count them on your fingers. Methuselah stands as one of the last lights in deepening darkness. His very survival becomes notable not just for its length, but for its rarity. He represents something the world has largely abandoned: the knowledge of the Creator. Lamech, his son, still lives for a time, father and son, both carrying the weight of being different, both knowing what most have forgotten, both watching wickedness spread like floodwaters through every corner of society. Then Lamech dies, 5 years before the actual flood, leaving Methuselah even more alone. Now it is just the ancient grandfather, and Noah and Noah's wife and their 3 sons with their wives. 8 souls total. 8 people in a world of millions who still acknowledge God, still resist the cultural current, still believe judgment matters and righteousness counts for something. The isolation must have been suffocating. Methuselah had lived through the transition, watched righteousness shift from normal to rare to almost extinct. The early centuries of his life likely saw more believers, more families teaching their children about the Creator, more communities organized around divine principles. But corruption has a way of spreading. Violence becomes acceptable once you rationalize it enough times. Wickedness feels normal once everyone around you participates. Standards erode slowly, then collapse suddenly. By Methuselah's final years, the righteous were not just outnumbered, they were despised. Noah's preaching drew mockery. His ark construction brought ridicule. His warnings fell on ears that had long since stopped hearing anything that challenged their chosen lifestyle. And Methuselah, the walking relic of an older world, stood beside him, ancient witness to how far things had fallen. The book of Genesis describes the world's condition with stark efficiency. The earth was corrupt before God and filled with violence. God looked at the earth and saw how corrupt it was, for all flesh had corrupted their way upon the earth. All flesh. Not most, not the majority. All, except 8 people. This creates a portrait of total societal collapse. Not merely political instability or economic struggle, but complete moral disintegration. The fundamental corruption of human consciousness itself. The Nephilim walked among them. Giants born from the union of fallen beings and human women, unnatural offspring representing the violation of created boundaries. Their presence alone testified to how thoroughly the world had abandoned divine order. Violence was everywhere. The Hebrew word Hamas appears here. It means more than mere physical harm. It carries connotations of wrongdoing, injustice, cruelty, the fabric of society torn apart by those who took what they wanted and crushed anyone who resisted. Methuselah witnessed it all. Century after century of degradation, watching the world his grandfather Adam had known become unrecognizable. The garden was a distant memory. The cherubim still guarded its entrance, but no one even sought it anymore. People had grown content in their corruption. The righteous remnant shrank. Names disappeared from the faithful line. Deaths came without replacement. Each funeral represented not just personal loss, but the diminishment of collective memory. When the old patriarchs died, they took their stories with them, their direct testimony, their first-hand accounts of God's dealings with early humanity. The younger generations who did not care to listen lost access to truth they did not even realize they needed. Methuselah carried those stories, preserved them through his impossible lifespan. But he could not force anyone to listen. Noah's family became the only audience that mattered. Picture the gathering. Methuselah, bent with age but still sharp in mind, sitting with his grandson's household. Shem, Ham, Japheth, listening as the ancient voice recounts what was and what will be. Your ancestor Adam walked with God in the cool of the day, Methuselah might have said. He knew the Creator's voice directly, spoke with him face to face. The world you see now, this was not what was intended. The young men would have heard stories passed down through 6 generations. Adam to Seth, to Enoch, to Kenan, to Mahalalel, to Jared, to Enoch, to Methuselah. Direct transmission across centuries, and they believed. Against all cultural pressure, despite the mockery, in defiance of a world that had abandoned these truths, 8 souls, that is all that remained. The text does not speculate about whether there might have been others, scattered individuals in distant regions who still honored God. Perhaps there were, but if so, they were not reachable, were not part of the salvation plan, were not brought into the ark. God worked with what was willing. Methuselah and Noah's household, the final remnant, the last witnesses, the only ones who would carry the knowledge of the old world into the new one coming after judgment. This creates terrible weight for their existence. They could not just quietly believe and ignore their surroundings. They had to actively resist, had to raise families counterculturally, had to maintain standards that made no sense to their neighbors. They were strangers in their own land, exiles while staying in place, people who belonged to an older covenant in a world that had written new rules. Methuselah's father, Enoch, had escaped this world entirely, walked with God and was taken, spared the burden of watching everything decay, given the mercy of departure before the worst arrived. But Methuselah remained, by divine design, sustained through the darkest centuries, made to witness the full corruption, to stand as testimony that God's patience, though long, was not infinite. He watched the remnant shrink until it fit in one boat. That was the plan. Reduce the variables, concentrate the faithful. Noah found grace in God's eyes. His sons followed his example. Their wives joined the faith. Methuselah stood as the elder statesman, the living connection to everything that came before. Outside this small circle, darkness. Not the darkness of ignorance. Worse, the darkness of informed rebellion. These people had heard the warnings, seen the evidence, watched the ark being built, listened to Methuselah's ancient voice speaking of judgment. They chose wickedness anyway, chose violence, chose corruption, chose to corrupt their way and fill the earth with wrongdoing, and therefore they would be removed. The remnant understood this. They saw what was coming, not with joy. You do not celebrate the coming destruction of your entire generation, but with clarity. They recognized that God's justice, though delayed, would eventually fall. Methuselah counted his remaining days, watched his body weaken, felt the approach of his prophesied end. When he died, it would signal. When he died, judgment would fall. When he died, only those inside the ark would survive. The dwindling remnant was about to dwindle to 8, and Methuselah, the last link to the old world, would close his eyes knowing that his death would open the floodgates. The righteous were few. Soon they would be fewer still, but they would survive. That was the promise. That was the plan. 8 souls, through water, into a new world. The ark nears completion. The structure dominates the landscape now. Massive, impossible to ignore. A wooden mountain rising from the plain where no mountain should exist. 3 stories of gopher wood sealed with pitch, dimensions that make visiting merchants stop and stare. 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, 30 cubits high. roughly 450 feet by 75 feet by 45 feet in modern measurements, large enough to hold cargo that would have required dozens of normal vessels, large enough to house animals in numbers that stagger the imagination. And all of it built on dry ground. Noah's hands know every timber, every joint, every sealed seam. He has spent decades measuring, cutting, fitting, sealing. His sons have grown from boys to men on these scaffolds. Their wives have never known their husbands apart from this work. The ark has consumed their lives. Methuselah walks the perimeter slowly, his steps careful now. Age has stolen the easy confidence of movement, but his eyes remain sharp, taking in every detail, noting the craftsmanship, recognizing the precision. This is not amateur work. Noah has built according to exact specifications, divine blueprints provided, human skill executing. The vessel is seaworthy despite being constructed by a man who has never sailed. It will float despite weighing thousands of tons. It will preserve life despite being designed for death all around it. The door stands ready. One entry point, large enough to admit the animals that will come, strong enough to seal against the waters that will rise, but still open, still allowing entrance, still permitting last-minute salvation if anyone would take it. No one comes. Methuselah watches the familiar pattern. Crowds gathering to mock, strangers pointing and laughing, local residents bringing visitors to see the crazy old man and his ridiculous boat. They treat it like entertainment, a curiosity, proof that some people believe absurd things. The ark stands as their invitation, and they see only comedy. Noah no longer tries to explain. He works, hammers, seals, prepares. His preaching has been through actions for years now. Every timber raised is a sermon. Every pitch-sealed board is a warning. Listen, turn, enter, be saved. The message is clear. The door is open. The means of escape stands ready. But hearts have hardened past the point of receiving. Methuselah remembers what his father Enoch told him. The visions, the prophecies, the certainty of coming judgment. He has carried that knowledge for 9 centuries. Watched the countdown tick closer year by year. Now it nears completion. Not just the ark, but the time allotted for repentance. The old patriarch places his weathered hand on the pitch-sealed wood, feels its solidity, its reality. This is happening. This massive undertaking that seemed impossible when Noah first described it, actually happening. The internal structure is complete. Rooms for the animals, storage for food, living quarters for Noah's family. Everything organized according to the divine plan. Efficient, practical, designed for survival during an event no human has yet witnessed. A global flood, water covering the earth, drowning everything, preserving only what floats inside this wooden refuge. Methuselah believes it, has always believed it. But believing and seeing are different experiences. The belief sustained him through centuries. The seeing confronts him in his final years. The ark is real. Therefore, the flood is coming. Therefore, his death approaches. Therefore, everything changes soon. He watches Noah's sons hauling final supplies, securing mechanisms, testing the door's massive hinges. These young men have known nothing but ark construction. Their entire adult lives spent preparing for catastrophe. What faith that requires. Building for a disaster you have never seen. Trusting prophecy over observable reality. Investing decades in a project the entire world calls foolish. But they persist. Because Noah believes. Because Methuselah confirms. Because the family has maintained faith across generations when everyone else abandoned it. The pitch smell fills the air. Fresh applications sealing any potential gaps. Noah is thorough, obsessive even. Every detail matters when you are building the difference between life and death. Methuselah asks, "Is it finished?" Noah steps back, surveys his work, wipes sweat from his face with a forearm black with pitch. "Nearly," he says. "The structure is complete. We are ready for the animals, ready for the water. Just final preparations now. Final preparations. The phrase hangs in the air between them. Final. The end approaching. The last tasks before the last days, before the last breath Methuselah will take. He knows his death will trigger events. The prophecy embedded in his name will manifest. When he is gone, judgment comes. The correlation is not coincidence. God has waited as long as his mercy allows. Methuselah's life has been the measuring line, the boundary marker, the grace period given physical form. That grace period nears its end. The old man looks at the ark one more time, traces the lines with ancient eyes, takes in the scope and scale, marvels that it actually exists, that his grandson actually built it, that the impossible has become timber and pitch and practical reality. You have done well, Methuselah says quietly. Noah meets his grandfather's gaze, sees something there. Recognition, perhaps. Acknowledgement that their shared burden is almost finished. I only obeyed. Noah responds. Obedience is everything. Methuselah says. They stand in silence, the ark looming, the world continuing its heedless path toward destruction. Two men who know what is coming while millions remain deliberately blind. The door is open. The ark is ready. The warnings have been spoken. Now comes the waiting, the final interval before divine patience expires and divine justice falls. Methuselah turns from the ark and walks slowly toward home, each step measured, each breath deliberate. His body tells him what his spirit already knows. The time is short. The end is near. The completion of the ark signals the completion of his purpose. He has stood between the world and judgment for 969 years. He has carried the knowledge of coming catastrophe through century after century. He has witnessed, warned, waited. Soon he will rest, and when he does, the door will close. The rain will begin. The world will learn that God's patience, though long, was never endless. The ark stands ready, complete, waiting only for its passengers and its purpose. Methuselah glances back one final time, sees Noah securing a final beam, sees the massive structure that will save 8 souls. Only 8. Out of millions. The math is devastating. The mercy is real. Both things true, simultaneously. He continues walking, the ark behind him, his death before him, the flood waiting in between. Everything is ready. Everything is in place. Everything stands prepared for the day when the oldest man in history closes his eyes, and the world, as it exists, comes to an end. The ark nears completion, and so does Methuselah. Both will fulfill their purpose soon.